these occasional promotions. To show you that our data fits or covers somewhat very well what are the official figures saying as regards the inflation developments. Here we show you the group 1.1, that is food, and here you can see that this online data, it's following quite closely what the official data is saying. It's not happening with all the groups, but it fits quite well. One of the features that we have observed for the Chilean economy, and that it has been already shown for other economies, is as regards product availability. One of the features during the pandemic, the government 18th of March declared a state of emergency. What we observe is a sharp decline in the number of price quotes. We know that these supermarkets, when they post the price of a product, is because they have the product and they have the ability to deliver this product. And when the product is not on the website, it's because it has been withdrawn. Here you can see that at the beginning of the state of alarm, the decline in the number of products was quite sharp, and it has been recovering quite slowly, and we are not back to pre-pandemic levels. For the retailer that we have a higher, longer time span, we observed that during the social outbreak there was no any change in terms of product availability. When we distinguish which type of goods have been declining, we can see that if we classify them as perishable, non-perishable, durable, emergency, the decline has been broad-based. What we observe also that at the beginning of the declaration of the state of alarm, what they declined more were the perishable and non-perishable goods together with emergency goods. We also have information as regards the brands that they are being sold for each division group. What we observe by distinguishing these three different periods is that if normally, on average, for each division group, there were 5 brands offering a product, a certain product, let's imagine, for example, rice. So we can see that there are no big differences during these 3 periods. But when we check for the number of varieties that they are being offered in each division group, for example, if rice had like, I don't know, 20 brands before the state of alarm, this was radically reduced. This is something that has been observed also in other countries, and one of the hypotheses that the brands, they have reduced the number of varieties that they are offering and reducing to just offer the most common products. So there was a reduction also on varieties. As regards price changes, the 2 measures are the extensive margin, is how many firms are changing or products are changing prices, and we can see that there is a lot of heterogeneity in terms of in each division the frequency of price changes, and that normally when there is a price increase, normally most of the times is an increase rather than a decrease, and that the average increase is higher than the average decrease. So this explains that normally inflation goes up, because you join this to the frequency and the size of changes, and then this makes your inflation go up. Here in this graph, I show you, for example, the measures on frequency and implied duration for food and beverages, and to compare the results when we use the raw data against the series that they have been filtered by the Nakamura-Steinson and Kijoe-Mitterrand. What we observe, as we expected, that, for example, that if on a given day 2% of the products being sold in food and beverages, the prices were changed. When we filter the series, there is a decline, and this is expected because with these filters we have reduced the volatility or the changes in the prices. And as the frequency goes down, the implied duration, that is the number of days that a product keeps the price unchanged, goes up. The interesting thing is to observe also how this frequency changes has changed over the 4 periods for which we have information. That is prior to the social outbreak, during the outbreak, the pandemic, and then when the uplift of the mobility restrictions have been uplifted. So we observed that during the outbreak and the pandemic, the proportion of goods that they were changing prices has been reduced. Also, this implied that durations were higher, and then once the mobility restrictions have been uplifted, the things have been, or the price setting has come back to the previous pattern. So in these tables, what we show is that there are different heterogeneity in the different type of goods, and that most of the division groups, they have behaved in the same pattern. They have reduced the degree of price adjustment. And here is also for other division groups like health, transport. For example, we can also observe that health medicines, normally they change very little prices. So here we can observe this kind of heterogeneity. We also compare our results to previous studies. And one of the main takeaways is that we get very similar results to previous studies, although they are not fully comparable because of the sample. But what we get is that in general, in emerging market economies, prices are usually more flexible. They adjust more frequently and high. As regards the size of changes, here we show you the distribution of non-zero price changes, and what we can observe is that normally price changes are tilted towards positive changes, and that during the pandemic and the social outbreak, this distribution is more skewed towards very small changes. So the main results of our work is that both shocks have changed the price settings and the behavior of the retailers. This is as expected. We have questions, or one of the issues underlying is whether this less flexibility is due to demand or supply conditions. So this will have important policy implications. If retailers are taking more a wait-and-see approach, so in order to avoid the fear of customer anger, they do not change prices. And we also observe that there has been more rigidity than in previous periods. We also observe a lot of heterogeneity in CPI groups. But once that the mobility restrictions have been lifted, and maybe also the supermarkets, retailers have been adapting to this new situation, we have gone through previous pricing patterns. That prices in Chile are more flexible than in advanced economies. This is important in terms of what happens with price setting during a big shock. So this was good to have this data available. We are wondering whether it's a demand issue or supply. is because the products that they are missing is because they need more social interaction to be produced, or they are less automatized. And in terms of the way ahead, what we are planning is to increase the coverage and keep updating the data set with information that will be coming. And I think it will be interesting to see what will happen next. And I think it's a good complement for traditional data compiled by the National Statistics.
Thank you very much, Elena. Very interesting presentation. We'll have a discussion later. So let's move now to Nicholas Levko from OECD, who will be talking about tracking activity in real time with Google Trends. Nicholas, feel free to unmute you and start sharing the slides. Don't press Ctrl L because this apparently...
I won't, I promise. Thank you very much. And thanks a lot to the organizers for the invitation. So
we
okay,
see...
do you see my slides in full screen? Is it okay?
Perfect. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Perfect. Go ahead.
So the OECD created at the onset of the crisis a weekly tracker of activity based on Google Trends. Let me start by a few words about the data. So the tracker covers 46 OECD, J20 and partner countries. As you know, for now, because there had been a lot of presentations using Google Trends in this conference, I think I'm the last, I'm not sure. Google Trends provides search volume indices, which are measures of relative search intensities for either categories of keywords or topics. And what's really neat when it comes to nowcasting GDP is that Google Trends cover multiple facets of economic activity: consumption, labor markets, housing and debt, industrial activity, and as Wouter showed yesterday, also economic sentiment and anxiety. Unlike data sources meant for the purpose of scientific analysis, Google Trends has loads of caveats and requires data processing, and we were doing very heavy pre-processing in this data, using first multiple sampling with the Google Trends official API to reduce sampling variance, addressing breaks in the series caused by changes in the data collection process. And also we use yearly log differences for Google Trends variables. Lastly, there's a common problem with Google Trends, which is illustrated by the chart at the bottom of this slide, which shows the searches for science in the US since 2004. As you can see, it's steadily decreasing. And that's due to one reason, it's a bias actually, the fact that the user base of Google search has been extending since 2004, from initially a small group of academics to now basically the whole world. So the relative search intensity for science has decreased. And we develop a specific method to address this long-term bias that I can dwell on in the Q&A if you are interested. So one caveat with Google Trends is that it's not linearly or trivially related to GDP. It's a search data. It's not industrial production or anything else. And that's why we have to resort to machine learning. We model the relationship between year-on-year GDP growth, that's Y here, on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, Google Trends variables, as well as country dummies, using two steps. In the first step, this relationship F is estimating using a neural panel model, a neural network trained on quarterly observations. And in the second step, F is applied to weekly Google Trend series and predict estimates of the year-on-year growth rate in weekly GDP. So that's nice because the tracker has a very intuitive year-on-year growth rate interpretation. We'll come back to this later. Why a neural panel model? Well, if we were to use country-specific models, we'd have way more variables than observations. And of course, we could have used lasso, but in this problem, I think variable selection is not the right approach. As I was saying earlier, the fact that we cover multiple facets of the economy is the strength of Google Trends, and we want to aggregate these together in order to get one signal about macroeconomy, not select a few of them. On the other hand, we could have used, and I tried many approaches before reaching this one. We could use, for instance, a ridge regression or a linear, whatever algorithm, linear panel model. But this in turn would have suffered from bias caused by cross-country heterogeneity in terms of institutional settings or in terms of the user habits. Maybe Japanese Google search users and French users don't have the same habits, and it would be a very strong hypothesis to surmise the elasticities should be the same. Here, our neural panel model that includes country dummies exploits a large sample of observations while capturing cross-country heterogeneity. Using country dummies in a neural network allows the model to flexibly capture any possible interaction between each Google Trends variable and each country dummy. Usual caveat with neural networks is that they're black boxes. They're not easy to understand. That's why we resort to interpretability techniques in order to open the black box. Here, most specifically, we use a technique called SHAP, which allows to decompose the predictions made by the model into each variable's contribution. So in the standard setting of a centered linear model, the Shapley value, the contribution of any variable x, would simply be xi times beta, okay, the coefficient times the value of the variable. Here in our case, you see on the left-hand side chart, the top variables in terms of the most important variables in terms of their contribution. Each dot represents their contribution for one observation, and the pinker, the higher the feature value, the bluer, the lower the feature. For instance, if you look at the top variable, which is unemployment, so unemployment is the most important variable in the model, we see that when searches for unemployment are very high, the contribution to this variable to the prediction is minus 0.3 percentage points. Sorry. We can go a bit further using this tool. And on this chart, I show, so still the contribution of the variable searches for unemployment, okay, on the y-axis, against the value of this variable, searches for unemployment, on the axis. And so each dot corresponds to one observation. And that's called a partial dependency plot, a partial dependence plot. And it's super interesting because, well, once again, in the standard linear setting, what you would have seen is one single straight line with low beta, beta being the coefficient associated to the variable. Here, we see that the country captures country-specific elasticities. And for instance, the weekly tracker is more sensitive to searches for unemployment in Argentina than in the UK. And it also captures the fact that for some reason, I'm not going to talk about it, the elasticities for France and Australia are very much the same. How well does it work? So we perform forecast simulations in pseudo real time, so out of sample. For instance, I want to predict Q1. I use all the information available until the end of March and make a forecast for the GDP that would be released around April or May. So it's M-1. On average, the weekly tracker is 37% more accurate than an AR1 across countries. And so here I'm showing only J7 countries, but what's really interesting is that even though there are some heterogeneity across countries, it generalizes really well. And for basically all 46 countries, with maybe one or two exceptions, it works well. It's reasonably accurate. And that's interesting because it's one model that works well for 46 countries. And for instance, in France, it's 5 times more accurate than an AR1. We can focus here on the out-of-sample predictions for Q2 and see that the tracker captures the downturn in all 46 countries but Korea. And the mean absolute forecast error is around 4 percentage points, which is reasonably low, given the magnitude of the shock in Q2. Lastly, it's one thing to backtest the model at the quarterly frequency. It's another to backtest at the weekly frequency. So here, in order to see whether the weekly estimates are also accurate, I'm comparing the weekly tracker with Google mobility data. Okay, I'm simply superimposing the two series on charts with two independent y-axes, so as to get the same scales for both of them. And there is no modeling whatsoever. It's purely out of sample. And here it's super interesting to see that the tracker gets the timing right. In each country but Japan, in this sample, the fall in activity due to in March occurs. The timing of the fall is accurately captured by the model and corresponds to the fall in mobility. Now let's see the results now and the OECD weekly tracker. So here it's for the US on a rather long period, and it's interesting to see that prior to the crisis, it's basically useless because increasing the frequency of GDP measurements don't add much information content to what we get. But once the crisis starts in March, we see that activity evolves at a much faster pace than quarterly and even monthly. It's intra-monthly. We see a drop of nearly 20% in activity in the space of 3 weeks. The OECD weekly tracker is useful to policymakers first because it's high frequency and it allows to have some granular insights on the impact of the lockdowns. Here, the darkness of the gray backgrounds indicates confinement stringency based on Oxford Atlantic data. It's also useful because it's near real time. It comes with a 5-day release delay. And for instance, here for France and Italy, it provides us with early insights on the impact of the second waves of lockdowns. In EMEs, here selected J20 EMEs, we see that there is massive heterogeneity in terms of the dynamics of the rebound. And for instance, the situation is extremely worrying in Argentina, where we see that the activity remains far below its pre-crisis level. We can draw early insights for Q4, but by comparing the blue bars, which are the tracker projection for October, and the green dots, which are the OECD projections for Q4. And this histogram sheds light on the fact that the recovery was strong, but slowed down around June and remains uneven and incomplete. And for instance, here for Great Britain, the activity in October remains 9% below the 2019 level. Another interesting feature of the weekly tracker is that we can go a bit further in terms of the sectoral analysis by decomposing the various components of the tracker. So here we are back to the Shapley values, okay? So the contribution of each variable that I have grouped together using arbitrary groups that I thought to be economically significant. And and here we show for France and Argentina, an interesting feature is that the big chunk of the decrease in activity during the crisis is caused by consumption in general, and more specifically consumption in services. It can be the fact that we know that the drop in activity was mostly caused by drops in consumption. It can also be the fact here that the signal from Google Trends is stronger for consumption than other groups, which result in the algorithm putting more weight on these categories. Interestingly here, we can compare the aggregate Shapley values for search keywords and categories entering the consumption goods category and variables entering the consumption services category. And we see that there can be an increase in the search for consumption goods, while a large chunk of the decrease in the tracker in August was driven by lower consumption services goods. And lastly, we can compare here the average search intensities across OECD and J20 countries in August, on the left for selected consumption services categories and on the right for selected consumption goods categories. And we see indeed that there is a strong and potentially lasting shift in consumption patterns. And unlike previous crises, including the global financial crisis, the consumption of durable goods, for instance here home furnishing or home appliances, it remains higher than pre-crisis levels. So that's a distinctive feature of this crisis. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. That was very interesting. So now let's go over some questions. So first, Ryan, Yu Cheng Yang from Princeton is asking whether you try to use the census data to just for sample representativeness of different data sources. And I have another question for you, Ryan. Some people argue that the COVID recession will apply a lot of reallocation. So how do your results on business exit relate to reallocation?
Okay. Yeah. So with respect to census data, a very good question. The ADP data we showed, we used sampling weights from the BLS. And so we understand the sampling properties of those pretty well. Some of the other data sources, we haven't done that yet, but we do have a pretty good handle on what they do represent. So for example, Homebase is basically just firms with fewer than 50 employees in just a couple of industries. And you can put sampling weights on it, but it doesn't add a ton of value because you already know you're not really representing very much. Combining them together to get sort of an overall signal would be a good idea. And we haven't tried that, but we will certainly think about it. Tomas asked about reallocation. I mean, I would say our results are consistent with the idea that reallocation has risen this year, or that there has been a lot of reallocation. Just sort of mechanically, like we do find higher exit in some areas, and most measures of reallocation would rise on that. We also know in the United States there's been a lot of applications for new businesses. We know that there's been employment growth in certain industries that benefit from the pandemic, like non-store retailers, certain types of truck transportation, warehousing, and so on, food and beverage stores. So I think our results are certainly consistent with the idea that reallocation has gone up. How much of, we don't know much about intertemporal substitution. We don't know if things are going to reallocate back toward the restaurant sector once COVID's gone. And we don't know how permanent some of these changes are. We also don't know how much of the exit we see is exit being pulled forward from the future. And we also don't know if there's some exit that's being delayed by COVID in certain industries. And so we think lots of open questions, but certainly, consistent with higher reallocation.
Thank you. Very interesting, Ryan. Elvira, I have a question for you. So it's interesting that despite these big shocks of social outbreak and pandemic, you find prices to be more rigid. So is it possible to check in your data whether you also find more price stickiness during the pandemic period, for example, for the goods that were in very high demand and for goods that were unavailable for some time during the pandemic? When they reappear, do they reappear at higher prices? So is it possible to check this in your data?
Yes, that we can check it. Normally, what we observe is that prices did not change as much as we would expect. Even when they reappear, they come back close to the previous price. So that's one of the kind of puzzles, because economic theory will tell you, like, okay, if there is an increase in demand or problems in producing certain type of goods, you would expect to see price increases. We do not observe in general terms. We can find some kind of products that maybe they increase the price, but it's not. We did not observe this type of behavior. It's also what they found Caballo during earthquakes, that they also observe this decline in product availability, and when they come back, they do not observe neither these sharp increases. And what they label it, the fear of hunger from customers. And there is also a paper for the US also when there are snowstorms and these kind of events, and that they don't find it either. So, and it's called this fear of hunger. So maybe it will increase afterwards. Maybe in some months we will see it, but for the moment, it seems that they are keeping prices under control.
Very interesting. And Nicholas, I have a question for you. So you compare your GDP forecast based on Google Trends to AR4 model. And I was thinking, would it be also possible to compare your forecasts to forecasts made by professional forecasters or international institutions that publish such forecasts? And another question. So I saw that unemployment was very important. You showed in your slides was a very important term driving a lot of your results. And I was thinking whether it would be possible to build the same model, but for the unemployment rate, which would basically give you the advantage because you have unemployment data are available at the monthly basis as opposed to quarterly for GDP.
Okay, thanks for the two super interesting questions. About the first one and comparing to the consensus. Yep, that's an excellent question. Of course, we could. I fully reckon the AR4 benchmark is very limited. Why is that? It's because I'm not claiming to have better quarterly forecast than what we can do with standard indicators. The distinctive added value from the tracker is to provide earlier insights and higher frequency estimates. So that's why I don't dwell too much on the backtesting of the quarterly model. It's just that it's much harder to backtest the weekly model because we don't have a existing ground truth weekly GDP series. About your second question on unemployment, yeah, that's a great idea, definitely. Actually, it's something I've been planning to do for quite a few weeks now, and also because it could be super interesting if it works well to exploit the regional granularity of the Google Trends data.
Perfect. Yeah. Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, actually, we in the US also we are using a lot of Google Trends for trying to see what's happening with unemployment rates and with unemployment data. So that was a very interesting session. So thank you everyone for participants, for presenters, and for participants for questions. So if you have any more questions, yeah, feel free to write them in the chat. And I think we are just on time to start the virtual coffee break. So thanks again.
Okay, thank you very much, Thomas.
Thank you.
this is Ricardo. I just want to make sure that we're all set for the next session, which starts in 5 minutes. I see that Akriti is here.
I think we should be fine. I mean,
Yeah.
I haven't seen. I mean, did you check? Whether all the presenters are in the panelist list?
Yeah, I see that Akriti is here. Isabella is here. Isabella, you're presenting the paper.
Yeah.
And excellent. And Angel is here. Angel, are you presenting the paper? Maybe he's on break.
Let me get some water.
Akriti, I'm gonna give you the make you a presenter.
Sure.
So if you want to just try like sharing your slides, that would be super. So when we start, we can go straight to your presentation.
Is that okay?
Looks perfect.
Great. And my audio is okay as well.
It's fantastic. Thank you.
Great. Thanks.
Just that I don't have to repeat this. So this is a lightning round. So we're gonna have 10 minutes for the papers. Then we can have a 5-minute Q&A right after the paper is presented. If I see that there are no comments or questions coming through the chat, I can give you an extra few minutes if you want, but I'll play it by ear. So I'm gonna give you like a 3-minute warning before the 10 minutes. And then if we reach the 10 minutes and we don't have any comments or 9 minutes and with no questions or comments, I can tell you that you can have an extra couple of minutes. And then we'll have another 10 minutes at the end for general discussions and for questions from the audience. So.
Okay.
Sounds great.
Okay, so let me start on time. So we're very glad to have three fantastic papers for this session on NLP applications for central banking. So this is session 7B. Akriti Mathur will start us with a very nice paper on analyzing monetary policy statements of the Reserve Bank of India. So Akriti, again, you have 10 minutes. We'll have 5 minutes for Q&A right after. But if you need an extra couple of minutes, we can deal with that if we don't have comments or questions. But I encourage everyone to ask all comments and questions. So this is not to dissuade you, but please ask questions because that's the best outcome for the authors. So please, Akriti, take it away.
Thanks, Ricardo. Hi, everyone. Very good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Akriti Mathur, and it's a great pleasure to be able to talk to you about this paper. We're very grateful to the organizers at the Bank of Italy and the Fed for having us here. So this is work that I've been developing at the Graduate Institute in Geneva with my co-author Rajeshwari Sengupta, who's in IGIDR. And a little tidbit is that we've been working virtually on this paper for 3 years, even before COVID. So nothing has changed for us in terms of working patterns. Okay, so let me get started. I don't think I need to sort of do a deep dive into central bank communication and why it's important for this audience. But it's useful to sort of recap a little bit that the consensus from the literature is that central bank communication is extremely important. And that if the central bank communication or the statements are unclear or too complicated or not very easily understandable, then they can lead to high sort of policy uncertainty and also unwanted volatility in financial markets. Now, one thing to be said here is that most of this research that reaches this consensus is on advanced economies, and there's very good reasons for why that is the case. If we were to sort of start thinking about how central bank communication works in emerging economies, we have to sort of figure with a few unique characteristics in these economies. And this sort of starts from things like weak or gradual monetary policy transmission to sort of underdeveloped financial markets and a host of things in between. So this paper is sort of a first stab in that direction. We sort of start by looking at central bank communication in a large emerging economy, which is India. There's another reason why looking at India is sort of particularly interesting at this juncture, which is that up until about October 2016, India did not have official inflation targeting. Actually, since about 1998 to 2015, we had a multiple indicators approach. And what that meant was that there was a lot, sort of the central bank's mandate was quite wide. And they had to look at a bunch of things before making their monetary policy announcements. And this starts from things like inflation and growth, and all the way to the external account, subnational fiscal imbalances, and everything in between. So what this implied was that communication was often an afterthought, and that statements were very broad in scope, which meant that they were also very long, so about 60 to 80 pages long, which is longer than a master's thesis. There was also no sort of preset schedule of monetary policy announcements. What happened in around 2015, 2016, when we started moving towards inflation targeting, was that this all changed. Communication sort of became more important, and that's sort of a given because inflation targeting is successful. Its success hinges on sort of anchoring inflation expectations, and communication is just the first step in that direction. And we saw massive improvements in the communication strategy and in the statements themselves. So the statements became about 2/3 in the length, so they became about 5 to 20 pages long. Their contents were restricted in scope, so a lot more focus on just inflation and growth. And now there was a sort of a preset schedule of monetary policy announcements with fixed intervals between meetings. Just to give you a sense of how wide the scope of the central bank's mandate used to be, the left panel, so this slide essentially just shows you very simple word clouds of the 14 most frequent words. in the monetary policy statements in the left-hand side between 1997 to 2003, and then on the right-hand side once inflation targeting was adopted. And you can see that on the left-hand side, there's a lot of things going on. And this variation in topics or content is actually not just across regimes, but also within regimes. By regimes, I mean within governors. So you have these very unique patterns of sort of particular quarters having different topics, being of variable length, and this, of course, changes across regimes as well. So what this implies is that standard techniques like LDA, when applied to the full corpus, don't do that well because the statements are not sort of consistent in their setup or the topics they cover over the entire time period. So we think that there's a case to be made to look at India. And the way we think about this paper or this research is that we want to draw some lessons for inflation targeting. Or for communication under inflation targeting by looking at what has been learned over the past through the actions of the past 20 years. And we are going to sort of zero down on complexity. So we want to understand how the linguistic complexity of the RBI's monetary policy statements has evolved over the past 2 decades. We have a lot more sort of descriptives in the paper about this evolution than I'll show here. And then what I'm going to focus here is the second question, which is that are there any effects of the RBI's statement complexity on financial market volatility? Now, just as a side note, there's a lot of existing work on central bank communication, complexity, on using NLP for understanding this question. And we're certainly standing on the shoulders of a lot of giants here. So with that context, let me sort of jump into the data. So one caveat with working with EM data is that we're restricted by the number of monetary policy announcements or statements that there have been, which is 72. There's 5 governors between 1998 to 2018. And just as a reminder, inflation targeting starts in 2016 formally. So what we are interested in, or our variable of interest, is the monetary policy statement complexity. And we want to see how that has an effect on financial market volatility. So in complexity, we're going to be looking at 2 proxies. One is length, which is the number of words, and the second is readability, the Farr-Jenkins-Patterson 1951 index. But we also use other sort of popular measures like Gunning-Fogg, Flesch-Kinsale, and the results are broadly consistent. Now we think, or we prefer length as our sort of as the baseline measure of complexity, just because it's simple, it's intuitive, it's easy to understand. But we acknowledge that longer statements could still be sort of easy to understand or easily readable, and that's why we augment that with this readability index. For financial markets, we're going to look at equity, currency, and bond markets. Now, bond markets in India are a little less well developed than equity or currency markets. So we anticipate that we won't see much in the bond market results. Now, the mechanism that we have in mind here is belief dispersion. And this is sort of well established in the theoretical and empirical financial literature. What this means is that, or we think it means in this context, is that when you have statements that are longer, more complex, they have a lot more information in them that makes them cognitively taxing. There is greater scope for sort of market participants or analysts to formulate very different diverging views about the future stance of policy and the future stance of the future sort of improvements in inflation or growth. And what this sort of shows up as is volatility in financial markets. And the closest paper sort of theoretically...
Krati, you have a 1 minute left, but I'm going to give you a couple of extra minutes, so think about 3 more minutes.
Sure, that's great.
Okay.
Thanks, Ricardo. So the theoretical paper that would be closest to ours here would be Atmaz and Basak 2018. So this is just to give you a sense of the improvement in both length and readability in the past 20 years. So the length, the height of the bars tells you the length of the average statement, and the sort of lighter the color, the more readable it is. So you see that we start with about 15 to 20,000 words in one statement, which is massive, and then go down to about 3,000 words to the MPC. Just keep in mind that the MPCs, Indian MPC statements are still about 6 times longer than that of the FOMC. So this is going to be our methodology, very straightforward. We're going to look at the volatility in equity, currency, and bond markets. We're going to always control for monetary policy surprises, always going to control for the volatility in the past week, always going to have some sort of regime, quarter, recession, or day dummies. And we're going to augment, so our main variable of interest here is log words, but we're going to augment this with some readability indicators. So our main results show that a 1% increase in the length of the RBI's monetary policy statements, about 100 words, leads to an increase in both stock and currency market volatility, about 0.25%. But there's no effect in bond market volatility. Conditional on length, there is no additional effect of readability on financial market volatility unless we zoom in to the top 1 to 5% most unreadable statements, but that really reduces the number of observations we have, as you can imagine. And the results hold with other popular measures of readability. So we have a bunch of robustness checks that I can sort of discuss at a later stage, but let me just conclude very quickly. So the objective of the paper is really to draw lessons from 20 years of monetary policy communication for a large emerging economy that has only recently transitioned to inflation targeting. We show that communication complexity increases financial market volatility because it induces belief dispersion. And in the next steps, we have a bunch of ideas that we'd like to implement, but I'm happy to hear your thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I have a couple of questions from the chat. So the first one is by Giuseppe. The question is whether the readability index is computed from English or Sanskrit. The second one, you can write them down and then I answer them together. The second one is how did you manage to calculate readability? What is the method or model? The third one is impact of document complexity on market behavior is something new. Generally, market will look at broad actions and our general sentiment prevailing in policy statements. So I think that was more for as a comment. So do you have some thoughts? And maybe let me add another comment suggestion. One thing that I liked about your word clouds was the dispersion of words and topics. You thought about thinking about capturing that dispersion in some way and correlating it directly with the financial measure. So if you talk about capturing that diffusion of topics that they perhaps have been narrowing down over time in a more direct way, it would be interesting. Go ahead. You have 2 minutes.
Sure. Thanks, Ricardo. Thanks to the others for your questions. So on the question on readability, yes, it is on English because the RBI's official working language is English. How is readability calculated? So we use the Farr-Jenkins-Patterson index, which is basically a formula that is, I think, captures the number of words per sentence and then the number of monosyllabic words per sentence, and then translates that to the numbers to sort of an index for 100 words. And the coefficients are fixed. So this is based on a 1951 paper. We think that there's some issues with using something that is static. But the literature sort of uses this, and sort of that's what we go ahead with. We also use the Fleshkin-Said, which translates an index into the number of years of education. But we find that variable does not. There's no dispersion in that. Basically, you need 18 years of education to read any of the statements on average, starting from 1998 to 2018. So that doesn't help very much. On market sentiments, yes, agreed. That's kind of the direction we want to go in. using something like the Loudon-McDonald dictionary applied to the corpus as is does not work very well, because the sentences are very long, very complex, and they usually have directional changes. So in the end, the sentiment turns out to be zero if you use sort of the usual indicators. And that's why we're going to go in with a manual scoring technique. And we also sort of control for things like EPU or VIX, which might drive broader sentiment and broader movements in the financial markets. So what we found when thinking about diffusion in topics is that the best way to capture those is actually the regime fixed effects. So Governor 1 between 1997 to 2003 has very different way of sort of formatting his statements or the topics that he talks about in his statements as compared to Governor 3 between 2008 and 11. If you have any ideas on sort of particular measures that we could use for those diffusion in topics, we'd be very, very keen to hear about that. Thanks.
Fantastic. So that was great. I have a couple of more questions, but we can address them at the end.
Sure.
Akriti, can you pass the little ball to Isabella so that she can? Yeah, and now you can share your screen, I think.
Hi. Okay. I still don't have the ability to share my screen.
Okay, so I think we have two of you. So maybe, yeah, does it work now?
Yes. Okay.
Perfect. Fantastic.
Possibility.
1 second.
No problem. So let me introduce you while you put up your slides.
Okay, I'm just having an issue with my Adobe. I'm sorry.
No problem.
Let's try it again.
Yeah, so Isabella is going to present a very nice paper titled "When the Markets Get COVID: Contagion, Viruses, and Information Diffusion." So.
Okay, just one second.
No problem at all. There you go.
There we go. Murphy's Law, right?
Fantastic. Exactly. Great. Thank you. Take it away.
Thank you. So it's a pleasure to be here, and a big thanks to everybody listening, and of course to the Federal Reserve Board and the Bank of Italy for organizing. This has been such an interesting conference. It's really an honor to be here presenting. So I'm presenting this paper, When Markets Get COVID, and it's a joint paper with my advisor, Max Croce, and two other PhD students at Bocconi, Maria Jose and Paolo. And you can see us here together working virtually over Skype. So to give you a little bit of motivation behind this paper, when the pandemic first hit, I was in Italy, and as most of you I'm sure know, Italy was one of the first countries to be severely hit by the virus, and we were all anxiously awaiting these 6 p.m. news briefings with the Prime Minister on TV. And since my personal research is about news and information and how markets incorporate information into asset prices, when Max called me and wanted to work on a project about coronavirus, we immediately knew that we wanted to study these unprecedented announcements and study how these were being incorporated into asset markets. So we tried to, we started off with a few questions, and we tried to answer these questions in our study today. So first, it's what is the financial impact of these medical announcements, these announcements about coronavirus contagion and containment policies? Second, can the local contagion conditions predict excess returns? And this is key because this helps us understand whether these containment policies are worthwhile in terms of people's wealth. And third, what is the market price of the global and local contagion news? So in order to answer these questions, we needed some new data sets. So first, we needed a comprehensive data set on announcements. because we wanted to look at the impact of these medical announcements. And second, we needed a high-frequency database about contagion news. Of course, there was already contagion news available on the daily level, the number of cases each day. But since we started our analysis at the very beginning of the pandemic, we had such a short time series, we really wanted to do a high-frequency analysis, so we were able to match our minute-level return data with a minute-level contagion news data set that we built up. So again, this data collection process, there's two dimensions of it. So first, it's collecting these official health-related announcement times, and a lot of hours went into building this up. And the second was the collection of this coronavirus news, the production of news, the diffusion, and the tone of this news. So for the announcements, we hand collected the official press statements, which are made publicly available, of course, on the webpage of the various health departments for each country. If the webpage of the health department of a country has a timestamp, then we can collect this information right there when building up this data set. Of course, a lot of countries don't include this timestamp when they publish their announcements. So then we turn to Twitter to help us out with this. So we collected the Twitter accounts of official health departments or various government agencies. For example, in the US, the White House is the main government agency which announces COVID-related news. And then with Twitter, we're able to select the effective date and time of this news announcement. And of course, for each country, we remove redundant announcements. And of course, we treat each country individually to make sure we're collecting the appropriate news. So as of a few weeks ago, we had around 7,500 announcements for our cross-section of 21 countries. Most of these announcements are about medical bulletins and lockdowns, so 98% of these announcements, and just a few of these announcements are about are from governments and central banks, which are more related to monetary policy. So in the second phase of our data collection, we wanted to collect data on news. So basically to capture the attention and the sentiment of the market about information being provided about coronavirus in real time. So again, we wanted this high frequency, large span data. So we turned to Twitter. We also considered using Google, as some other authors in this conference have used, which is super interesting data. However, we wanted the data down to the minute level, and there are some limitations from Google when it comes to the granularity of the data. So instead, what we did was we looked at the Twitter accounts of major newspapers in our cross-section of 21 countries, and then we collected from these 85 newspapers in 12 languages, we collected all of the tweets about coronavirus in our sample. So we have around 450,000 COVID-related tweets so far. And so this way, we actually have news during market hours at the minute level. So here is just a quick visualization of the data. So you can see this is the daily number of tweets about coronavirus in each country. And there's many interesting things I could point out here, but for the sake of time, I'll move on to the econometrics. So in the next few slides, I'm going to show you graphs where we're looking at announcement returns. So these graphs are based on this regression. So on the left-hand side, we have Z. This is our cumulative return or our hourly return. And then we have this as a quadratic function of time. So we do this so we can test for a post-announcement difference. And then we'll visualize our final result. So I want to be clear here that the graphs I'm going to show you, I'll show you on the y-axis, I have a difference. So it's the difference between the epidemic period and the normal period. In the epidemic period, we consider this for each country when a country has more than 100 confirmed cases of coronavirus. And then the normal period is just any time before that, and our sample starts October 1st, 2019.
Isabella, you have 1 minute left, but I have just one question. So why don't you take a couple of minutes, 2 to 3 minutes to wrap up, and then we'll go to the question.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
So here, you can see these equity returns in advanced economies on the left and emerging economies on the right. And what I want you to focus on is this jump. You can see that announcements, on average, tend to help equities. And this is consistent with the idea that if investors have a preference for an early resolution of uncertainty, then we would expect to see this on average, kind of despite whether it's good or bad news. Then if you look at bond returns, you can see that in advanced economies, bonds are pretty much just a good hedge. They don't change much around announcements. And in emerging economies, there is some movement. Okay, and finally, I'll go over this quickly. We have a very simple linear asset pricing model where we have our excess return as a function of news, and then we have our time varying beta. And then news, we use the unexpected number of COVID positive cases or the unexpected improvement in the tone of our COVID related tweets. And once we estimate these equations, we can pin down lambda, which is our market price of risk. So just a quick summary of these results. Global news, looking at the tone of the tweets and the number of cases, is priced. However, when we look at regional news, we have some mixed results. So it seems that this global component is more important. And finally, our market price of risk is very, very large, but it's plausible because of our time varying betas are relatively quite small. And finally, I can show you just this graph of our estimated expected excess return. So this is just the time varying risk premium for the high COVID countries. So these are the countries with the largest share of COVID cases. And as you can see in the advanced economies on the left, in the equity market, this risk premium peaked in around April, and it's come down a lot, but it's still not zero. And as you can see in emerging economies, these economies are more exposed than advanced economies, with their risk exposure being much above zero for the entire sample. Okay, and so in conclusion, announcements tend to move the equity markets up on average. Bonds tend to be insensitive to this announcement move, except in emerging economies. And the market price of risk of coronavirus contagion and of the news is very high, and therefore containment policies could be very valuable in terms of wealth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabella. Fantastic presentation. I have one comment from the chat. Someone wants to know, so Anjana wants to know how you process and collected Twitter data. So if you can spend 1 minute on that. And I have a question about in the US, subnational announcements were also important. So announcements by the states, for example, and they come throughout the day. Did you collect some information like that? Is that prevalent across other countries? Just your thoughts on that would be useful. Thank you.
Okay, so for the Twitter data, we use the official API. So I guess we collect Twitter data for two things. So first, it's the newspapers. So we started with a set of newspapers from Baker and co-authors that have been shown in the literature are important newspapers for each country. Then we find their Twitter accounts and we use the official API. Luckily, we were doing this in real time, so we could use the API. And we collected all of the tweets that said coronavirus or COVID-19. From there, we filter out some tweets that may have to do with financial news, and we focus on those. So I hope that answers your question. And then in regard to the state news, so each country, I mean, we spend many hours on this, and every week we go over these announcements by hand. So for each country, we treat it individually. So yes, in the US, we do include some state announcements. So as time went by, we chose the 10 states with the most coronavirus cases, so the most important states, and then we monitor like the Twitter accounts of their governor or their state health department in order to capture these announcements. So that's why we have so many announcements. It's really a rich set of data, and that's why we have 3 PhD students working on this every single week, and so hopefully we can make this data available. That's our goal, so that other people can work on it as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We can continue the conversation later in the Q&A session. That was a very nice presentation. So Angel, you're gonna present next. Isabel,
Okay.
can you please pass the presentation rights to Angel? You have to right click on his name and then
Okay, you should be the presenter now.
perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so let me move this away. So this presentation has 2 parts. The first part will be presented by Teresa. So Teresa, you.
Okay. Hello everybody. Thank you for inviting us to present our paper application of test management to the analysis of climate-related disclosures. A tragedy in the horizon. That's how McCartney, in a historic speech in 2015, described the impact of climate change on financial stability while being chairman of the Financial Stability Board. He explained that the repricing of financial assets due to climate change will occur, although we don't know at which speed it will happen. If it happens suddenly, a so-called Minsky moment, this will be a financial stability risk. So he proposed the creation of a task force to create a framework for firms to publish information about their carbon footprint and how they manage their risk and how well or badly prepared they are. This framework would help investors in their decision making. This way, it would help a smooth price adjustment as opinion change, and it would prevent this sudden fall. The idea was that better information about the costs, opportunities, and risks created by climate change can promote timely responses. Just a few months before, the European Directive 2014/95, also known as Non-Financial Disclosure Directive, saw the light. In Spain, it wasn't transposed until 2018, and the Global Reporting Initiative was recommended as a model. In 2017, the TCFD published the recommendation with a significant overlap with the GRI standard. So, even if the recommendations were published in 2017, and the transposition of the European directive was done later, it still makes sense to check for TCFD recommended disclosure prior to this. And that is what we did. We took the corporate reports in Spanish of the 12 significant Spanish institutions, and we calculated a TCFD compliance index in an automatic way from 2014 until 2019. In the status report of 2018, the TCFD also used artificial intelligence to calculate compliance, but it wasn't very clear how they did this. It was performed on corporate reports in English, and apparently they used mainly annual reports and ESG reports. So instead, we used Spanish reports, and we included sector-specific reports and country-specific reports. Finally,
we use a method that we believe is flexible, easily interpretable, and opens the door for future enhancement using machine learning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Teresa. Okay, so how did we do it? We took the corporate reports and we converted them into Word format using Kofax Power PDF. Having the documents in Word format allowed us to take into account the formatting. For example, we could identify when a piece of text was a table, a title, or a bullet point, and treat it differently. So the next step was to further partition these Word documents into excerpts. And in this case, we used Python to identify the excerpts. Then what we did was we tokenized the excerpts using the Spacey library. And we put the excerpts in a data store where we could perform a full text search, similar to Google search, using an engine and a tool specifically designed and developed for this project. Now, to create a TCFD compliance index, we need to understand the domain. In this case, the recommendations. So we need domain knowledge of the TCFD recommendations. So a quick introduction to the recommendations. There are 11 recommended disclosures that fall into 4 main recommendations. So the first one is governance, which describes the link between climate change and the board and the management of the company, with 2 disclosures. Strategy, which describes the risks and opportunities of climate change in the short, medium, and long term, with 3 disclosures. Risk management, which describes how those risks are assessed and managed, with 3 disclosures. And finally, metrics and targets, with the actual measurements to check if the company is actually following the strategy and the risk management, with 3 disclosures. But it turns out that these disclosures are somewhat vague, and each disclosure actually refers to multiple things. So what we did was we took those 11 recommended disclosures and we further divided the disclosures into 91 fine-grained disclosures. For each fine-grained disclosure, we identified manually the concepts that we consider the essence of the disclosure. So, for example, this is the first disclosure of the first recommendation, or the first recommended disclosure of the governance, describe the board's oversight on climate-related risks and opportunities. And one fine-grained disclosure within these recommended disclosures would be describe the frequency of the board's meetings with a sustainability committee. In this disclosure, in this fine-grained disclosure, we chose as key concepts the board, the frequency, and the sustainability committee. So if those 3 concepts appear in an excerpt, we are pretty confident that the excerpt relates to this fine-grained disclosure. But there are many ways to refer to the board, to the frequency, and to the sustainability committee. So we use a technique that is called named entity recognition, which is a technique to identify terms or group of terms that refer to a specific label. This technique can be applied using either machine learning or a rule-based model. In this paper, we use a rule-based model. A machine learning model requires lots of text already labeled, like this, to train the model. But using a rule-based model opens a door to make this easier. With text automatically pre-labeled with a rule-based model, the labeling effort afterwards to create, to annotate the training set required by a machine learning model would be much simplified. Anyway, this would be something for a future paper. What we did in this paper is we use lexicons, regular expressions, and rules. We use this model and we applied the model to the excerpts that we had, and we use the same approach and the same search tool that we use on the data store to search for these labels using a simple query language. So the 91 fine-grained disclosures were mapped to 205 queries. And for each disclosure, having up to 3 queries, and each of those 3 queries were graded with a level of confidence we had from 1 to 3. So for example, if a fine-grained disclosure following the TCFD guidelines, sustainability disclosures do not always refer to climate change disclosures. So in certain fine-grained disclosures, we score lower those that were referring to the concept of sustainability instead of the climate change concept. After running the 205 queries with the corresponding weights on the corporate reports of the 12 significant Spanish institutions, we summarize the results in these two charts. The first chart represents the average index for each of the 4 categories and for each year. And the second chart represents the percentage of disclosures found in each report type. Let's focus on the first chart. In general, the score shows an upward trend from 2014 to 2019. But let me just highlight 2 things. First, the difference between the board and the management. We think that this is because the reporting regulation in Spain is more focused on board disclosures than management disclosures. For example, there's a mandatory report on remuneration of the board members, but there's nothing on the management team. Second, the resilience of a strategy is the one with the lowest score. The resilience of a strategy refers to the strategy of the organization in different climate-related scenarios, including a scenario where the temperature is 2 degrees higher. This scenario analysis is something that definitely needs improvement. As per the second chart, each fine-grained disclosure is counted only once. So I would like to highlight that both the remuneration of directors and the Pillar 3 reports are sometimes the only place where central disclosures are found. So it's important to take them into consideration.
I know you have 2 minutes left.
Yeah, thank you. To conclude, whenever there's a need to review large amounts of documents, using an NLP techniques together with a text search engine can reduce the effort required by analyzing the work. It can also be used to create compliance metrics, such as the one that we created for the TCFD recommendations. By starting with a rule-based model, we have now the foundation to try more advanced machine learning models using the same approach. And as per the results, we saw that reporting following the TCFD recommendations is improving every year, although there are certain areas that are still lagging. Besides, it's important to consider that both sector and country-specific reports, such as Pillar 3 reports and remuneration of directors, are important. And thank you very much. And we are now open for questions.
So I don't have any questions from the chat yet, but I had a couple of questions. Have you tried looking at whether this assessment varies by sector, or if you're looking at banks, whether it varies by the exposures of the bank? So if the exposures are in some way correlated with the nature of who's disclosing them, and the second one. The second question is related more to the process in which you're capturing this. You have some ways of capturing this, but there are other entities like rating agencies and I think providers like Refinitiv that also capture these ESG indexes. Have you tried comparing what you're getting relative to these other ways of capturing? I'm not sure about the methodology that they use, but they're also trying to assess whether there's enough transparency or whether they're complying with some levels of disclosure. So have you tried doing that comparison? I don't know how widely available are those indexes for Spain, but that would be another way of validating whether what you're getting is similar to what others are getting. I mean, it's fine if you're getting something different, but just a way of validating at least the first step.
Right. Thank you. There's interesting points. Yes, we regarding the first one, correlating with exposure, for example, of the banks, we haven't done that. Still, we are only looking at 12 significant institutions, so the sample in the number of banks is small. So I'm not sure whether the conclusions would be significant in this case, but it's an interesting point anyway. And regarding comparison with ESG disclosures, we haven't done that. That would also be interesting, but also take into account that ESG is really, really wide. It has a really wide scope, while climate-related disclosures is very, very, very specific. And the TCFD recommendations are really specific. And if you read specifically the guidelines, they are really specific things that they are interested in, and those things that really could affect the risk of the company reporting those disclosures. While ESG reports are very focused on, we found that they are really used as a marketing tool, and they do not disclose that much information. They might follow the GRI standard, but they really do not focus on the specificities of the TCFD.
Thank you. That's a very good answer. I have a couple of questions going back to Akriti's presentation, so maybe she can address them to the general audience. So the first one is, Akriti, you got no effect. Sorry, my question just moved. You got no effect on bond market volatility, but looking at the connection with bond market, one expects higher impact on bond market. Don't you think so? The second one is sort of related. Central bank communication should move financial markets if they contain like a surprise effect. The central bank shares already available information. Investors possibly ignore those messages. Are you able to identify communication surprises? So very briefly, if you can address those.
Sure. Thanks, Ricardo. Thanks to the others for the questions. So on the bond market, so the Indian bond market is actually quite small when you compare it either to the equity or currency markets in India or to other emerging or advanced economies. It's also quite illiquid. Most of the placement sort of happens in the primary market. And therefore, we are not really that surprised to see that there's no movement in the bond markets. And this is, I think, a result that is fairly well discussed also in the literature about the lack of liquidity and the lack of the size of the Indian bond market. And then the other question is on the monetary policy surprises. Yes, so that's a very, very valid point. India does not have interest rate futures, so it's very difficult to sort of measure monetary policy surprises. So what we do in this paper is that we use data on overnight index swaps. So the change in that is being used as a monetary policy surprise. And that's actually one of the contributions of the paper as well, to provide a first series of monetary policy surprises for India. So we control for that everywhere in the paper, and the results hold with that. So thanks.
Excellent. I also have another question for Isabella. Thinking about I mean, you talked briefly about announcements coming from or health-related announcements, and then there are other announcements by central banks and other institutions. So, I mean, when you're looking at asset prices, both of those two things could be fighting against each other, because the central banks could be providing more accommodation, while they at the same time health conditions are deteriorating in some way. Have you tried to tease out how policy reacted to bad developments on the health side, and how asset price movements were mitigated by the announcements that were more policy oriented and were aimed at curtailing the effect of these health events?
So right now we have these two categories of the government-related or monetary policy announcements, and then the health announcements. And our results are only using the health-related announcements because of exactly your point. You're totally right. So we we haven't tried to tease anything out because we know that, of course, these government-related policies are going to have immediate impacts on financial markets. But yes, we have these two categories exactly. So maybe in later stages of the paper, we can look into that.
Or whether the sensitivity has changed as there's more I don't know, support for the economy. Has the sensitivity between health announcements and the asset prices, has that changed over time, just to see whether that the policy accommodation has weakened that link?
Yes, exactly. So I mean, now luckily, as the time, I don't know if it's luckily that the time series of this pandemic is getting longer, but unfortunately, the time series is getting longer, and so now we have some heterogeneity in with the different types of policies. So we probably can look at that.
Fantastic. Thank you all for this wonderful session. I think the three papers were fantastic. Excellent presentations, excellent Q&A. Right now, we have a 10-minute coffee break. I think, well, yeah, it's a 10 or 15-minute coffee break. Let me see. Oh, we still have, yeah, we have until 17:55 is the coffee break. The coffee break starts at 17:55, and then we have 10 minutes after that the big panel discussion. So for that, you have to move to room A, because the panel and later the concluding remarks are going to be in panel A. So in the chat, you have the information on how to get there. You have to quit this room and go over there. If you guys want to stay here to chat a bit more about the different papers, please do so. We still have